Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, good morning, depending on when you're tuning in. Welcome to the latest edition, the November 5th edition of the Great Thinkers Lecture Series. I want to welcome you all. My name is Brian Burgoon. I'm the Academic Director of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, the AISSR. And I'm going to host and introduce our Great Thinker Lecture for today. And I do so on behalf of the AISSR at the University of Amsterdam, but also on behalf of SPI 25, with whom we sponsor this series. It's an online series, of course, since we're all still in the middle of the corona crisis, the second wave of the corona crisis, as it turns out. So sadly, we're not able to join this lecture in person. But nonetheless, we're able to do what we try to accomplish with this Great Thinker lecture series, which is to have a member of our research community within the AISSR to introduce an important scholar, an influential researcher for our community, who we want everyone in the community to be familiar with. And that can include the works of well-known greats who are long since dead, or it can be newer living great thinkers who have important contributions to share with us in the social sciences. And today that's no different. It's a discussion with Nanke Verloo, Dr. Nanke Verloo from the University of Amsterdam in the Department of Urban Planning. And Nanke is going to introduce the scholarship of Chantal Mouffe, who's one of the founding thinkers in the sort of post-structuralist, post-positivist movement in discourse analysis, particularly influential in international relations. And Nanke is a person poised to do this well for the simple reason that this is an important thinker in her own research, looking at urban conflict and the reassessment, the recreation of patterns of conflict and conflict resolution and deliberation in the dealing with urban conflicts. So it's really great that, Nanke, you're in a position to tell us about Mouffe's scholarship and work. Nanke is going to do that in about 45 minutes, after which there will be time for questions. And as Nanke is giving her presentation, her lecture, know that you can start asking questions in the question and answer screen. I will curate those questions when Nanke is finished with her presentation. So without further ado, take it away, Nanke. Sorry. Hi. Yes, hello, hi. Yeah, I can't give you a hand apparently. But sorry, this is a seminar that a big lecture that I introduced. Yeah. So thin, yeah. In general, this won't be going on like this. So this is just this one moment, and I'll try to. Nanke Verloo, yeah, that's somebody within, and Chantal Mouffe is giving the presentation. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start, Brian. So welcome to this seminar on the work of Chantal Mouffe. To me, Chantal Mouffe is a great lecturer and a great thinker, because throughout her work, she developed an alternative understanding of democratic practice. And she deals with important questions that anyone who is working on democracy, either local or national or global democracy, can recognize. She works on issues of identity construction, of ideals of being inclusive and trying to engage everyone, on aspirations of the power to the people. And she offers a critical and sharp understanding and often unexpected analysis of these issues, and she departs from dominant perspectives. So I think Chantal Mouffe is a very interesting thinker if we want to learn more about democracy. Let's see how this, yeah. So, of course, Chantal Mouffe wrote many books, many more than that I can discuss in 40 or 45 minutes. So for this lecture, I picked out a couple of her work that are basically bringing together her idea of an agonistic democracy or radical democracy. First, of course, her first work together with Ernesto Laclau that she wrote in 1985, and that is seen as a classic work on post-Marxism and the understanding of hegemony, but also her work on the democratic paradox, where she critically analyzes the deliberative approaches that we use nowadays to democracy. Her work on the return of the political, where she proposes to deal with the post-political state in which she thinks we currently are. And her work on agonistics and finally far-left populism will all be discussed in this lecture today. Now, why is Chantal Mouffe so important for understanding our world today? Well, of course, on a day like this, the 5th of November, on the top of our minds is the American elections. And I think that whatever the results of these elections are going to be, again, these elections and the votes, they show that there are many people feeling uncomfortable with traditional democratic elites and practices. People don't feel represented by their government, and they search for alternatives that then end up in votes for example, President Trump. This is not only happening in the United States. This is also something that we can recognize. This is also something that we can recognize here in the Netherlands. Growing mistrust of government and also a widening gap between citizens and the state, and is visible all over Europe and maybe all over the world. And I think Mouffe's work really helps us understand those processes, but also helps us formulate an alternative to these processes. Secondly, over the past years, we have witnessed a global growth in the amount of social movements. Various issues of injustice have been contested. Climate change, racial injustice, gender inequality, rising nationalism. From Hong Kong to Sao Paulo to Cairo to New York, people were standing up and going through the streets to protest and to make undemocratic governments change, and to combat somehow the dominance of capital investments that are ruling and that are creating privatization and deregulations of the common good, like public transport, housing, or educations. So we could say that both on the left and on the right, people are fed up with the status quo. And Mouffe's work helps us to understand why this is happening, but also she offers some ways of working towards social change that we all are apparently so fancying. Mouffe therefore calls this moment a populist moment. She says it is the post-democratic context of the erosion of the democratic ideals of popular sovereignty and equality that the populist moment should be apprehended. It is characterized by the emergence of manifold resistances against a politico-economic system that is increasingly perceived as being controlled by privileged elite who are deaf to the demands of the other people in society. Now, Mouffe, of course, like Brian already introduced, is also somebody who is working within an academic context. Some say that she is in fact one of the first few who started thinking in a post-Marxist way, where she reworks classical Marxism by refusing essentialism. So they, for example, argue that it's not just one privileged group that may rise to contest society, like the working class, but that this is a plural, that there is a plurality of groups that can contest society and create change. She is also one of the first post-structuralists who seeks to understand an object, in her case democracy, in relation always to systems of knowledge that produce these objects. And her work is closely related to philosophers who rethink disagreement, like, for example, Jacques Rancière, or more recent work on the post-political, like the work of Erik Swingedouw or Jonathan Metzger. Now, what can we really learn from Chantal Mouffe? The basis of Mouffe's work argues that she seeks to acknowledge that power is a constitutive of the social. The main question of democratic politics is how to eliminate power, but is not how to eliminate power, but how to constitute forms of power that are compatible with democratic values. And she uses two basic concepts, hegemony and antagonism, to analyze power and to also make sense of the forms of power that are compatible with democratic values. So let's dive a little bit deeper into these two central concepts in her work. Mouffe argues that we should recognize the hegemonic nature of every kind of social order and the envisaging society as the product of a series of practices whose aim is to establish order in the context of contingency. So in other words, she develops a theory of hegemony based on Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony that shows that how elites can maintain power not only through coercion and economic force, but also through ideology. When ideas, values, and norms propagated by elites become accepted by citizens as a common sense, they provide legitimacy to those powers and they help maintain the status quo. Now, Mouffe and Laclau are very critical of that kind of hegemonic power, but they also argue that this is not a static issue, that of course these things can change through different contexts and through different times, but that social change is not inevitable, like you would, for example, learn from Marxism. It does not necessarily happen, and we should understand these forms in which hegemonic ideologies become contested, and also the different forms by which they become changed, and also in which context these changes are successful. So the second thing that they teach us is that these types of change don't only involve one privileged group, but that a plurality of groups can formulate these changes. I think you see a picture here of the civil rights movement. Well, this is one movement that caused an immense social change, obviously, but also examples like the feminist movement, other movements, hopefully now the Black Lives Matter movements, they may cause, or they can cause, a real change in the way we understand and know the world. And third, she also teaches us in this work that social change and the way that these different groups can formulate those changes require that they basically hook up with an existing and accepted discourse that allows movements to frame their inequalities as a form of oppression. Like, for example, we have seen in the feminist movement that they have hooked on to this larger idea that men and women are equal, which has not always been a dominant understanding, of course. So we see that by hooking up to this idea that everyone is equal, they were able to formulate a real change in the way we understand the relationship between men and women. Now, it's of course important to understand that Mouffe does not see this relationship of oppression as a fixed entity either. So there are aspects of our lives where power inequality is accepted, for example, between adults and children, or between your manager and employees at work. But that there are norms that steer what we think is acceptable in these relationships. So the question is really who decides when a relationship of equality turns into a relationship of oppression. And of course, we should also ask the very critical question, who has the right to tell someone that they are in a relationship of oppression? And Mouffe thinks that this is exactly where social movements come in, and where they can not only foster change in the system, but also really change in the way we understand our own relationship to others in society. Now, these two concepts, hegemony and antagonism, are really central to Mouf's work and will inform also the things that I will talk about later. Antagonism, what does she really mean with that? Because of course it immediately raises questions about the questions that somehow make us fearful for conflict, for contestation, for confrontation. Well, she shows that antagonism in itself shouldn't be seen as something so scary. She shows that to think of the political always bears a dimension of difference. So antagonism is inherent in human life and in the formation of collective identities. We can only know who we are if we can demarcate another, a certain they. In a democracy, these differences of ideals, of interests, of beliefs, of identities are crucial. They should be all voiced, acknowledged, and celebrated for a democracy to flourish. This does not mean that we have to be enemies. A radical democracy acknowledges that people may be, instead of enemies, adversaries. So an enemy is someone whom we don't have much in common, and we see each other very differently. But an adversary is somebody who we have a sort of ethical, political principles of democracy in common. And we can discuss and be open about our differences. And we can, through being open about our differences, showcase what kind of differences there are and who are we and they in society, and try to reformulate those boundaries. Only when the others, who were up to now considered as simply different from us, start to be perceived as putting into question our own identity and threatening our existence, is when agonism turns in antagonism, and where adversaries turn in enemies. And this is, of course, what we see happening in the United States at the moment. We see a healthy, legitimate form of adversary and difference turn into antagonistic disagreements, where people are turning into enemies of each other because they feel threatened for their own existence. So for Mouffe, this is a very dangerous moment, and this is exactly a moment where we have to be very critical of the way we are dealing with democracy, and that is not by searching for consensus, she would argue. So her main, and I think a central argument in her work has been that that the way that we have been practicing democracy so far has been very much focused on consensus. Of course, she finds the whole stream of deliberative democracy, in which policymakers try to engage citizens in various ways and through different models to come to conclusions that are somehow mediated and somehow consensual. She finds it very commendable because it offers an alternative to just the representative democracy, in which citizens do not more than vote. So she finds it commendable, but she also notices, and I think that is a very big contribution to where we are now in democratic governance theory, that no matter how equal and fair these deliberative models are, and how we try to construct them as equally and fair as possible, there is always an exclusionary effect, because not all citizens can equally take part in deliberative procedures. Some people don't have the vocabulary to do so. Some people don't know the different performances that are needed to be done or that are needed to be performed in these types of meetings or participatory venues or deliberative moments with policymakers. So there is always an exclusionary element there. Also, her conception of citizenship is not rooted in this idea of civic virtues that allow people to formulate arguments and deliberative procedures. She says that actually political engagement is rooted in passions that move citizens and the effect with which these express their ideas, passions, caring about something, being angry, loving something, or becoming frustrated are things, are emotions that are in deliberative practices, yeah, somehow frowned upon, because everybody has to behave as a virtuous citizen who is able to rationally explain their ideals and somehow perform the Habermasian idea of a ideal speech act. Well, Mouffe says no. By doing so, we are tapping into a wrong idea of citizenship, and also we are ignoring power relations that are already embedded in the structure of speech acts. So she is critical of that Habermasian idea, but that doesn't mean that she denies reason. Arguing that citizenship is rooted in passions doesn't mean that citizens are not rational. It is just adding the idea that rationality and passion are basically the same thing, and that even our rational ideas are constructed and shaped through these types of political hegemonies that we have been discussed earlier, that produce our idea of what we see as rational, or what we see as a natural given, or what we see as logic. And she says, no, we should really be much more critical of these structures that formulate and shape our ideas, and also allow different forms of citizenship in that reveal the passions of citizens and the way that they engage with these political topics. Now that we know what she thinks democracy should not be, let's look at what she thinks democracy should be. So she proposes the idea of a radical democracy. And to understand that idea, I think we have to dive into three topics that she lays out. First of all, plural identities. The second, the political, and the third, conflict. Now, plural identities, what does she mean by that? So she argues that every identity is in itself relational. So the affirmation of a difference is a precondition for the existence of any identity. So it is about a constitution of a we that requires, as its very condition, to know also who is a they. And this in itself is not a problem, she says. What is a problem if we don't allow or are transparent about the way we formulate these types of we's and they's? So she argues for a pluralist democracy that is open to confrontation between these different identity constructions. And she says that being open about that and allowing these constructions to be somehow openly voiced is essential for establishing collective identities and understanding who is more in or excluded from our democratic practices. So this also includes that people who feel that they are marginalized can dissent different types of politics, and who can also contest the ways that they are treated by different decision-making processes, which also means that by acknowledging these plural identities, policy-making always is a process of a contingency. So every single decision should be transparent about who are the winners and who are the losers in this decision, who is basically making a better deal here than others, which then opens the space for the others to dissent those policy decision makings, and also to maybe change the way these policies came to be and the hegemonic structures that underline these policies. So plural identities and trying to acknowledging all of them. The second is a differentiation between what she calls the political and politics. So Mouffe makes an important distinction there. She argues that the political refers to the dimension of antagonism which may take forms and can emerge in diverse social relations but cannot be eradicated. It is a natural part of human life. Politics, on the other hand, refers to the ensemble of practices, discourses, and institutions that seek to create certain order and organize human coexistence. This distinction does not mean that Mouffe argues to reject institutions. She basically tries to make clear that what we are doing in democratic practice at the moment is mostly politics. We are mostly organizing and managing the ensemble of practices, discourses, and institutions, and we are not really engaging very often with the political. So with the differences between ourselves and others, with being open about that conflict and the conflicts of our ideals, ideologies, and also our interests. And she argues that we should be much more open about that. So that she doesn't reject institutions, because institutions are important, an important actor in the transparency that we should have about these temporary decisions that policy making really is, and also be an actor in trying to respond carefully to people who dissent those decisions. And then the third, so conflict. Conflict in her idea is, so I don't think she uses the word conflict herself very much. She basically speaks mostly about contestation or confrontation. And she argues that contestation provides an alternative for democracy because it engages collective passion as a channel through which citizens express themselves, in democratic politics as a means to mobilize those passions towards democratic designs. She would argue that the center of democracy, so people, parties, or even policies that are at the center, is basically an empty space. Because if we take seriously the core principle that everyone in democracy is equal, that also means that no one has a privileged claim to power or to the truth. So the political is the recognition that all political ideals, norms, and values are contested, and that this contestation between these differences discursively construct our social reality. So she would argue that we should recognize that kind of equality from these differences, and that plurality is essential for democracy to function. So that everybody should be discussing from their position and their positionality to, uphold all these different plural voices in society, but also in political decision making. And again, that means that we should recognize that political decision making is a circular act. So democracy itself, but also decision making, is not an end product. It is a circulation that is established in a certain moment with a certain background of the way we understand ourselves, a sort of hegemonic structure that allows specific norms and values to be more dominant at that moment, and that can in time and in different contexts also be descended by people who may change these structures. Okay, what does that really teach us about local democratic practices? And how can we translate these rather theoretical ideas? I want to take you to 3 different spaces where I think her work can become very clearly discussed. The first is a case study that I did myself in The Hague, in a neighborhood called the Schilderswijk, which is notoriously famous for its diversity. In good and in bad ways, it is famous for its diversity. 92% of the population in this neighborhood is of immigrant background, and 83% of those is from so-called non-Western descent. But this neighborhood was also very strongly stigmatized by a Dutch national newspaper as being a Sharia triangle where people were becoming radicalized Muslims. Later on, that news had to be taken back because it turned out to not be based on any evidence. But something happened in this neighborhood when a group of youngsters started to demonstrate against the occupation of Gaza. And in that demonstration, some of the youngsters started using or waving ISIS flags. And this performance caused a strong national response. And it caused also a Dutch nationalist group to come to take to the streets and wave Dutch flags in response. Now, these confrontations of both global and national concerns were all played out at the locality of this neighborhood, at the street level, really. And according to the citizens of these neighborhoods, they were not really representing what they thought was going on in their neighborhoods. So they hang this banner, "We aren't ISIS, we are in crisis." Now, after a couple of confrontations on the street and also between military police and people on the street and demonstrators from different sides, the mayor intervened here. And his intervention was to basically close off the whole public space in that neighborhood for any other protest and move the protest to the area of The Hague, the Malieveld, where traditionally national protests are being held. That decision, of course, was very strongly criticized by people also studying democratic practice. They said, yeah, this is a strong closure of the public sphere, so it's an undemocratic move. But when you dig a little bit deeper into the case, you could see that in fact, this closing of the space in that moment and moving the demonstrations to another side wasn't at all closing the public sphere. It actually opened the public sphere for more plural voices who were marginalized in this big global and national contestation between groups who had nothing to do with the locality and the people in the neighborhood. So his decision opened a space for plural voices of the neighborhood to argue who they really wanted to be. And they started also to develop all sorts of community practices and to meet each other around these demonstrations, and also the topic of who are we together as the neighborhood of the Schilderswijk. So the mayor brought in an element of doubt here, where there were two very clear stories framing the neighborhood in a certain way. He allowed a third narrative in that framed the neighborhood in a different way, that said, hey, we are a neighborhood in crisis here. We are framed by many other people, but we want to frame ourselves and we want to construct our own identity here. So by addressing all these audiences, he reframes an idea that seemed to be certain into a doubtful idea of what this neighborhood really was and what these demonstrations were really about. So he creates a space for new meaning, a space for plural voices to be heard. And he allowed a small group of people to voice their own story in the public sphere. So you could say that his practice in itself actually allowed for a more agonistic space in the Schilderswijk than opening this space for all sorts of dominant voices that were overturning the identifications and the story of the citizens there locally. Now, another example, of course, is the example of public participation. This is an area where I actually see a total lack of the ideas of Chantal Mouffe. At the moment, I'm an urban citizen fellow at NIAS and the municipality of Amsterdam, and I'm again researching a public participation project in which the local government has invested since 2 years, really investing in all sorts of creative ideas of how to engage citizens, how to talk to each other, different ways, designing creative deliberation, I don't know what. And still, this process ended up in citizens feeling frustrated, feeling unheard, and then turning into a protest group against the very same project in which they participated for more than 2 years. Now, what's going on here? Well, first of all, I think that with this ideal of consensus and dialogue, there is very little space for disagreement in these types of processes. So the process wasn't really inclusive. Although they try to be inclusive, it isn't inclusive to voices who have a different idea about what should be going on there. Second of all, under the whole idea of being equal, power relations are totally hidden in these processes. So under the ideal that everybody should be talking equally, there is no clarity on who is in the end responsible for making the decision and who can make the decision about the final steps of the project, which of course in the end creates a big backlash for the people who have been involved since the very start but don't see their own ideas or their narratives, their stories back in the final project that then of course is in hands of people, politicians and people who are chosen to be there. I don't think that Chantal Mouffe would argue that these people shouldn't be chosen to be there. She also wouldn't say that the mandate or the decision should be in the hands of other people. She would argue that these types of power relations should be very transparent and that they should have an opening to be contested. And if they are not transparent, they are basically, we are basically not allowing plural voices and different ideas to really be in. We are, making a sort of charade of deliberation and trying to do participatory work that in the end is not really participatory. Now, the third domain in which I think Mouffe's work is very helpful is, of course, in art. And this is also where she herself makes an argument for artistic practices and how they can contribute to unsettling these types of hegemonic dominations. So Mouffe argues that artistic and cultural practices can offer spaces for resistance that undermine the social imaginary necessary for capital reproduction. And I think it's very interesting how she builds up this argument, referring to all sorts of tensions between, of course, neoliberal and post-Fordist societies where there is very little space for artists to work independently. But she also argues that these new configurations in which the relationship between labor, art, intellectualism are totally blurred, that they offer new spaces for artists to really take these kinds of roles. And she also argues that the public space is a very important element in these, in taking up these different spaces. So the public space is crucial because public spaces are meant to create consensus in the way that they are now formulated and also designed. But she says, from an agonistic perspective, public spaces should allow conflicting points of view, and they should give space to confront these conflicting points of view without any possibility of final reconciliation. So again, here she is arguing that we shouldn't be so much focused on consensus, but we should allow these kinds of confrontations in, and especially in the public spaces where this then might provide us with ways to create new imaginaries about what our society could be like. And of course, artists who are much more related and close to different aesthetics and different ways of bringing in emotional effects are in a very important position to build these new imaginaries that may offer us ways for the future. Now, finally, Mouffe has always blurred the boundaries between being an activist and being a scholar. I'm not sure if she sees it like this herself, of course, But in my view, I think she is a very beautiful example of somebody who doesn't really, feels restricted by academic ideas of staying on the outside or not intervening in the world. Of course, also in her coming from her theoretical perspective, this wouldn't also make much sense. So she also wrote this final book, For a Left Populism, where she really brings in some hands-on ways to make us think of an alternative to the growing right-wing votes that we are seeing in Europe and in other places nowadays. So she basically argues that to stop the rise of right-wing populist parties, it is necessary to design a proper political answer through a left populism that brings together all democratic movements that struggle against post-democracy and that aim at reconstructing a collective we, the people. Finally, I can imagine that some of you are thinking, okay, sounds cool, sounds interesting, but, confrontation always has this risk of, ending up in the sort of essentialist forms of identification, or ending up in moral values that are non-negotiable, and where everybody just stands in their position and be angry at each other or be dismissive of each other, basically into where she says adversaries turn into enemies. But according to Mouffe, the combination of a focus on consensus and the constant, trying to find consensus, pretending that there are no unequal power relations, and also excluding voices from the political, voices that are now trying to be heard once again, she says that the aversion towards confrontation leads to apathy and to a dissatisfaction with political participation. And I think that is exactly what I can see happening in my research in local democratic practice. That by engaging people in so many ways, in different decision-making processes, but by constantly creating this sort of frustration with that particular process, people are experiencing dissatisfaction and frustration with democracy over and over again. And of course, at the local level, this is where you engage and also feel and experience these types of frustration. But that, of course, extrapolates to the way we then experience our relationship to the state. So that also means that, especially at the local level, we can, try to change these experiences and have a much more, inclusive form that also allows people to voice their identities that are not so easily heard or recognized in our society, and that are really demanding a voice in this very moment. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Nanke. And first of all, I really apologize that my mute was not on when you got started, when my friend knocked on my door.
That's okay. You gave me a moment to share my screen properly.
Okay, excellent. So let me start with, well, first of all, let me remind everybody that if they have questions, they can do so. They can state them in the question and answer so I can curate them. But I have a bunch of questions for you, and I'm very provoked by this work. I think it's really important work, and you did a wonderful job summarizing its basic tenets. And so I want to ask a couple of what I see as challenging questions that are partly informed by previous, in fact, recent great thinkers discussions, including our last discussion with Viviane Matisse-Bohm over talking about her presentation of Habermas's work.
Yeah.
You do a really good job of explaining how Mouffe is particularly interested in developing these ideas of hegemony and antagonism as fundamental features of human interaction generally, and I think conflictual situations particularly. And you make this distinction between adversary and enemy. And that to me is quite fundamental to the story that she tells when she tries to basically encourage conflict to become more open and honest about the depth of difference of opinion and about the differences in power, right? These are, I really see that claim, but I'm really suspicious of the idea that this should be championed to the point where you say, let that happen, things will be okay. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the limits of that, or the ways of, the way you think she thinks about the limits of agonistic politics, as opposed to, it doesn't have to be deliberative politics, but democratic politics, where we assume that and we try to push towards seeing our antagonists as adversaries rather than enemies. There's a sort of presumption that they are in the world of reasonable differences, as you yourself was were articulating. To me, the politics that she's embracing, agonistic politics, is in a sense trying to emphasize the differences and trying to emphasize the power differences in a way that makes it harder to, to paint our antagonists as adversaries within the world of reasonable differences with whom we can contest and make progress in governing ourselves. Does she have something to say about that, about the limits? Or does she simply want to say, don't go too far with that deliberation? Anyway, I want to hear what you have to say about this,
it's
fundamental issue.
It's hard for me, of course, to explain what I think she would say. But what I learned from her work is that, of course, this is exactly the struggle that I'm also struggling with, because I'm trying to translate this at a very local level. And of course, there it becomes super practical. So it's not only a theory of who is, of democratic practice anymore. It is actual democratic practice, and then to push people into a state of antagonism and then not being able to move out of that anymore doesn't bring us to a solution, you could argue, or it even brings us to very dangerous situations where it turns into violence. I think what I learned from her work is that, well, first of all, it's not like situations of deliberative governments don't turn into violence. They are also a form of violence. They are all, but maybe their violence is less obvious, because it's all under the banner of we are listening to each other. It's very friendly, basically. So that kind of pushes these kind of violent acts under the surface. And in a way, every type of policy making is maybe a form of violence, because there is always a group who is losing out of that. And she would argue that that instead of pretending that this is not the case, we should just make it clear so that these groups can then stand up and also have a voice in changing these ideas. Of course, that depends on our ability again, and this is maybe where we could start to. She then says that adversaries are people who share an ethical, political, common idea. And in a way, you could argue, what is the difference between that and sharing the idea that we want to come to a solution together, right? So a more deliberative approach. Because if we are sharing some sort of common idea of how we are expressing ourselves, what kind of ethics are behind that, then we are back a little bit at the basis of Habermas.
But I mean, this is exactly the issue that I want to explore with you, thinking about Mouffe's work. So I'm completely with her and with your summary of her work when it comes to the idea that you don't want to paper over differences, that you want to have a kind of agonistic politics that makes possible the venting of the expression of real differences on positions of really difficult issues in social and political life. And I'm equally committed to the idea that you want to let those differences be expressed in a way that reveal power differences. So that basically the antagonistic and the hegemonic features of social life are crucial, and that might be made possible by her vision of politics. What I want to know is what needs to be done extra to avoid that becoming where it all ends, or where that, in a sense, can devolve into or can escalate into more violent, more polarized politics, right? So there's this common idea of affective polarization as opposed to sort of substantive polarization, where effective polarization is about seeing the adversaries as enemies who are basically evil, versus adversaries who you can try to or push to try to do business with. So what are the conditions where you can avoid a situation where the agonistic politics, in a sense, short circuits the possibility of progress in some fundamental way, peaceable progress for a community? Or is that something she doesn't care about, doesn't want to identify?
No, I think her answer to this is that she would say that there is no such a thing as a sort of consensus there. So there is, of course, the idea that people can share something with each other, that there is a sort of a common ethic there. But if there is none and people are really adversaries, I think she would argue that then politics, that is actually the political, right? That this is the moment where the political becomes clear, and that politicians should in those moments make a decision. And these decisions are based on their ideologies, which are, of course, also discursively constructed in that very moment. And
Yeah.
that politicians have the responsibility to make those decisions and then also to make clear why they do that, but also who is missing out in those
Yeah.
moments, so that other decisions can be made. If that becomes the dominant idea, I think she would really raise that to another level, basically, than to try to sort it out in the nitty-gritty of those interactions.
Yeah. So I have another question, a question that I see asked, which is about what possible, in a sense, boundary conditions, background conditions are necessary to promote the creation or the emergence of agonistic politics as opposed to that more closed kind of politics. What happens in the background that leads to that explosion? Is it or that expression of fuller difference, antagonisms and hegemonies? Is that something that is driven by leadership of particular groups, or is there something about the institutional setting? Is it the level of intensity of frustrations? What are the conditions that give rise to agonistic politics?
Well, I think that she shows very clearly the role of social movements in that, and also the way that they change our idea of what is natural and what is just and what is the good society. And that, of course, for her way to work, we need a very strong civil society where there are groups who are able to voice these claims on a much broader and more integrated level, so that they can also convince and somehow counter these hegemonic structures that are behind the kind of decisions that we make. So she's really there in her post-structuralist tradition, looking at an object, but seeing the whole complexity of power relations and structures behind that. And I think she brings the macro and the micro very much together in this way of looking, but they are also totally dependent on each other then.
And can you give an example of how this may have worked in one of your studies? So the three cases that you mentioned, the Schilderswijk in The Hague, the Bossenlomer example, the artistic example.
Now in Bossenlomer it didn't happen. So
yeah, no, I realize that. It's absence.
Yeah,
it's absence,
this is actually what I'm now trying to think through, like how could this have happened, right? But I don't have the answer yet. In the Schilderswijk, I think it was very interesting to see, because there actually these grand narratives were very strong and very dominant. But what was lacking there was the voice of local people who were really giving another meaning to both these demonstrations and also to the way that their neighborhood was framed. So there, the political decision of the mayor really provided a space for more voices to be heard. And in doing so, of course, he also closed one space off, but opened another. So there is still, you could still contest whether that is agonistic democracy, but I think that bringing in this element of doubt, that the Schilderswijk is not just the Sharia triangle, or it is just the place of where nationalists should be protesting to stand up for their country or something. By bringing in an element of doubt there, you bring in the possibility to change the meaning people give to this neighborhood, and also, yeah, the dominant perspective on that in the public debate. So there, they really brought global, national, and local meaning making together in the practice of governance.
Yeah. So I have a follow-on to this. So there's this question, another question that is asked is how the sort of internal bubbles that we get in our informational universe, our political universe,
Yeah.
Made possible or maybe created by the rise of social media, the fragmentation of media, but also the rise of social media in particular, how that might make the kind of dynamic you just described harder to be productive, right? So the Schilderswijk example involves the media taking a picture of one group saying, hey, we are Schilderswijk in a sense. And your point is, oh yeah, when another group comes up and says, no, we are Schilderswijk, and yet another group says, no, we are both of those things and neither, and that you're saying that's productive. But it presupposes that people are watching the same events from the different sides of those allegiances. And in our social media landscape, there's not that much sort of mutual sort of basis for even comparing notes about common or different identities. So how do you think about that as a challenge to the productive quality that you saw in Schilderswijk? Would that still be possible now?
But I think this is a very legitimate and very good question, because it might be the biggest challenge of all of this, right? I mean, if we don't get to see any other meaning making anymore, then how can social movements do their job, basically? And how can we really, if there is no dominant hegemony, because we all have different ideas of what is real, then yeah, what are counter hegemonies then? So I find this a very good question, and I'm, to be honest, very much looking forward to another book of her analyzing this new social relationship that we are in now, and also how, yeah, the left or whatever could respond to this.
Yeah. I think we have time for just a last question, and it's a question that is the most obvious one to ask, given the Trump politics that you're talking about and the polarization in the US that you made reference to, all in reference to the recent book by Chantal Mouffe about actually a plea for a left populism, right, that book. So here, the very specific question is, if you look at the United States right now, do you really believe that Chantal Mouffe is correct, that the only answer to Trump is, in a sense, a more aggressive populist left, or is it more, in a sense, it's obvious opposite? So something that does show that it's possible for Americans to live in one political space. To me, the current situation is proof that I think her story about left populism might be wrong. If I look at what's happening today on the streets.
But why? I don't see any left populism at the moment. I mean,
well, there's a lot of left pop to Biden or the Democratic Party. I'm referring to other aspects of democratic politics in the US. Anyway, let me just ask it more bluntly. Do you see the Trump story right now as what's going on in the election as affirmation of her book, her 2018 book, or as something that is in tension with it? Is your interpretation that this shows, yes, she was right? Just comment on how you think her argument is playing out on the streets of the US now.
Yeah, I think what I see of her argument in the way that the public or the political debate is unfolding, I recognize a lot. First of all, of course, I recognize that these people are frustrated and don't see themselves represented there. But I also recognize how the political is basically, there is no the political there. It's all just, attacking each other in this antagonistic way. And there is no content debate about what is the political, also what are the political decisions that we really make if you choose for either Biden or Trump. What is who wins, who loses, what is the consequence of these decisions is barely discussed. So that makes me rethink her work a lot. Whether left populism is the answer, of course, I'm also not sure. But I would have been very curious to know how these elections would have ended if other people would have been chosen to represent the Democratic Party, people who were actually bringing in the political there and who were having discussions about the social changes that might occur if they would have become president.
Now, that's a very eloquent way to end a celebration of Chantal Mouffe's work and her last book. So thank you very much, Nanke Verloo from the Department of Urban Planning at the University of Amsterdam for a really splendid Great Thinkers lecture. Thank you for joining us, those of you who watched live on YouTube or on this Zoom session. And this will be posted soon. And we welcome you all to join us at our next Great Thinkers in the coming months. So once again, thank you very much, Nanke.
Thank you, Brian.